So it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to Seeking Delphi. This is part two of the Longevity Dialogues, Selling the Science. Joining me are Aubrey DeGray, Keith Comito, and Nir Barzilai. I'm Mark Sackler. The future lives here. In part one of this series, we took a look at the long view, possibly some 15 to 20 years from now, when we might have some substantial human rejuvenation therapies available, how we would implement them, and what an indefinite lifespan might do, how it might affect the very meaning of human life. Today, though, we're going to pull back to a more short-term need, because to get there and possibly even accelerate it, make it sooner, to raise more money for the basic research that people like Aubrey and Nir are doing, and to convince the regulators, the public, the powers that be, that aging should be treated as a disease. It can be treated as a disease. So how do we sell the science? So first, let me introduce our panelists, and we'll start with the most visible face in longevity. He's been with us many times. He is the Chief Science Officer and co-founder of the SENS Research Foundation, and also author of Ending Aging. Aubrey, always great to have you on Seeking Delphi.
Well, thanks for having me back.
Next, we move on the screen. He sits to my right, down in the lower right-hand corner. We met him briefly at Undoing Aging last year, and that is Nir Barzilai. Nir is the founding director of the Institute for Aging at Einstein College of Medicine, Yeshiva University in New York, and a driving force behind the TAME trials to determine the possible benefits of metformin in delaying the diseases of aging. Nir, thanks for joining us.
Great being.
And of course, up there right next to me, somebody I've been talking to a lot lately, the founder and president of the Life Extension Advocacy Foundation, doing a lot of work to provide news on what's going on in the world of aging research, Keith Comito. Keith?
Great, thanks for having me again, Mark.
Sure, my pleasure. So there are really kind of three parts to this. And obviously, there's still a lot of work to be done in convincing the regulators, the legislators, and of course, the public as a whole to accelerate the research into ending the diseases of aging. But for the last 15 years, Aubrey, you've been fighting a battle just to get the majority of the scientific community on board. That's gone a long ways. And I wonder if you wouldn't, just for a couple of minutes, just review for us how that's gone, what you've had to go through, and where we stand right now relative to where we were a few years ago.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it took about 10 years. The whole thing started 20 years ago and 1 month and 8 days, to be precise, because on the 1st of October in the year 2000, I ran a little workshop with half a dozen experts from the biology of aging to attempt to shoot down this crazy new way of looking at doing something about aging that I had been thinking about for the previous couple of months. And yes, it was very new. The idea that we might be able to repair the accumulating damage of aging comprehensively enough to keep people healthy late in life, rather than the prevailing paradigm, which was that we should try to essentially make the body run more cleanly and generate damage more slowly. That was a big paradigm shift. And it did take the best part of a decade for a lot of my colleagues to really understand what I was saying well enough to be able to evaluate it, because it did entail bringing in a lot of science from areas of biology that were not previously connected with gerontology. So that was kind of, to be expected, really. And the very gratifying thing is that as time went on, certainly over the past decade, there has been a very widespread acceptance that this is a plausible and feasible way to think about alleviating the health problems of late life. Various people have essentially, restated the idea in slightly different terms. I never have to spend my time persuading biologists that this is a reasonable idea anymore. So yes, you're quite right. The battle now is pretty much squarely, exclusively on the wider world, which is still catching up with not only the idea that bringing aging under medical control might be feasible, but also, for that matter, the idea that it might even be desirable. And of course, I've been fighting that battle for at least the past 15 years as well, ever since I became reasonably high profile, started doing a lot of media, a lot of public speaking. It turned out to be a considerably tougher battle than taking a relatively small number of smart, knowledgeable people in the gerontology community and discussing an idea with them.
Nir, Keith, do you have anything to add to that, just in terms of, again, getting the scientific community on board first?
Yeah, so first of all, look, Aubrey wasn't only a prophet, but unlike many of the biblical prophets, he also spoke the truth. Okay, what he was talking about is real. The only thing I would say, when we say, Aubrey and me, widely accepted, it's accepted in the geroscientific community, but it's not accepted in, I would say, more than 90, maybe 99% of the scientists. Our coalition now, where we're growing, is the geroscience. There are more geroscientists every time. This community is growing, and that's great. And the second is the biotech. The people who are interested in biotech are understanding it well, and they're coming in. That's where we're growing. But my greatest frustration is with people like the ones who are leading the COVID effort, right? Because look, the NIH is the National Institutes of Health, right? There's the National Cancer Institute and the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. We are in silos, and those silos are not getting what we're telling him, that we are very relevant to them. In fact, they're institutes of disease. We are the Institute of Health. The people who are doing aging, we're the only Institute of Health at the NIH. And those silos are terrible. So even with COVID, the CDC doesn't have aging as a risk for COVID severe disease and mortality. They have what's likely and what's even more likely, and there are 20 things, and aging is not there. This silo is something that is so hard to break, and it's so frustrating to us at this point.
Yeah, if I could follow up from both of
Sure,
those
go ahead.
points. Yeah, from my perspective as a computer engineer originally, the great value in Aubrey's early work, give credit where it's due here with the 7 deadly things, which of course flowered into the hallmarks of aging, is having a useful framework or scaffold to orient the science as it's being discovered in the sense of how it could actually impact the aging process. I feel like that is what was lacking prior to that, and having that scaffold that can be iterated upon is what allows scientists to understand how their existing work can fit in. So I think that was partially the game changer then. But to follow it up to what Nir was saying is that I think that work needs to be continued also in terms of not just the science, but in the messaging, in that we need to really do a better job going forward to make it clear to all stakeholders that everything is connected, that if you want to overcome future pandemics or, horrible diseases like Alzheimer's, this is the best route to do that and basically get everything firing together. So I think we need to continue doing that and build an ecosystem that de-risks not just investors and policymakers, but de-risks researchers into doing this work and identifying it as the best route to whatever goal they're independently working on.
Yeah, there's one further thing I'd just like to say, following up, especially to what Nir said. I think, Nir, you're absolutely right that the siloing that we have been facing for so long very much still exists, and we still have a huge amount of work to do to fix it. But I think there's an interesting distinction here, which perhaps I didn't really pull out in what I said, which is, I think when we talk to medical researchers and other people in the medical research community who are not gerontologists, what they say privately is beginning to depart very sharply from what they say and do publicly. In other words, the siloing at this point, I think, is really a consequence of the of the ecosystem. In other words, of the perceived vested interests that people elsewhere in the biomedical community have. And privately, they kind of know that the preventative approach, which is essentially what the geroscience approach is actually what they ought to be focusing on. It's just that they won't be able to, keep their grants going quite so easily if they admit that publicly.
I'll give an example for why you're right, or also right. Howard Bachman, who was an editor of JAMA, I wrote him a letter and said, look what an ageism there is. This virus sees elderly and kills them, okay? And we wrote about geroscience a year before, and he said, bring me some papers, okay? Bring me some papers, let's talk about it. And I brought him 3 papers, and he basically, longer story, but he decided not to publish any one of them. So yeah, I see somewhere, but it's not the way, they're not catching the wave yet.
Well, that's interesting, and I'll have something to say about the whole silo issue toward the end of this, Nir. But to kind of move on to getting to those regulators and legislators and the like, and the issues with that, and particularly with the NIH, I think the issues you had with the FDA and NIH that you recounted with the TAME trials to me last year are kind of fascinating. And I wonder if you wouldn't very just quickly again summarize how that played down. And I'd like to know if anybody's seen any change in the intervening 18 months or so since then.
Well, we were a bunch of scientists that came to the FDA and said, we have an idea of how to show that we can target aging and move a whole cluster of diseases away, okay? We actually didn't come with those words. Those words were part of where we ended. But the FDA was open, and they got all their departments head, like 24 people participated from the FDA in this meeting, where we basically said, we want to repurpose a drug that's called metformin, because when we give metformin to animals, they live healthier and longer. And because we have all those evidence in humans that people on metformin have less diabetes, people on metformin have less cardiovascular disease, people on metformin have less cancers, less Alzheimer, less MCI, and less mortality. I mean, diabetic people with metformin have less mortality with non-diabetic people, So what more evidence do you need to approve of a trial like that? And there were 2 issues that we discussed. One issue was, okay, what are we doing? Are we calling aging a disease? And I have to give you a realpolitik check on that, okay? The FDA doesn't want to call aging a disease. The elderly don't want to be called a disease, especially now. You locked them already now, and now you want to tell them, you want to say that people over the 65 are sick. Not everybody is sick, okay? And American Federation of Aging Research doesn't want to call aging a disease. The Gerontological Society of America doesn't want to call. AARP, the retirement, doesn't want to. I think we should leave aging a disease because we don't need it. The FDA say, okay, you can call it whatever you want. What are we showing? Well, we're showing that we're preventing a cluster of diseases. Okay, we're moving, instead of getting those diseases in 2 years, you're going to get them in 4 years. Okay, that's a prevention. You call it, they told us, you think you're doing it by aging? No, some of them thought that metformin happens to do 5 different things, okay, at the same time. Okay, we don't care. What we care is that we show them that we prevent a cluster of age-related disease. We call it aging. They can call it whatever they want. It's irrelevant. So this is really the issue. The second issue was like, please, that's what we want to do. Tell us if you think differently, because we don't want to finish a study, and you'll tell us, oh, you should have done something else, okay? And it's interesting, just to show you how people think differently. We had to drop diabetes as an outcome. because for the FDA, diabetes is not an outcome. Diabetes is a chemical diagnosis, and people who get it, 40% of them in 10 years can get other complications. It's not like having a cancer, having Alzheimer, having mortality, right? Having cardiovascular disease. So we had to drop diabetes and recalculate the power of this study.
What about, I think then you had other issues when you then went to the NIH though, right?
Well, the NIH, so the issue with the NIH is the silo issue. We are the geroscientific community coming with a grant that everybody's involved. We have 14 centers across the nation with the major players in our field. So the grant went to review, and the study section were people from cardiovascular, people from cancer, people from Alzheimer, you know, and our summary statement is those guys are hallucinating that they think that aging can be targeted and one drug can do it. Okay, against the evidence that we brought them, it's just a belief. It's a belief system that we fought in. And then we just decided to go to American Federation of Aging Research. Still, we're probably getting the funding in the beginning of next year, but it's been really an incredible and too long of a road to get this study going. And that's why you're right, Mark, by saying we need to have practical approaches because it's so slow. It's frustratingly slow.
Yeah, no question about that. Aubrey, I'd be curious to know your viewpoint on the issues with dealing with government as a whole. And I've heard that in some places it might be starting to change, but I have a feeling it's still a pretty slow process.
Right, yes. I mean, of course, the ultimate thing that dominates this issue is a very easy thing to understand, namely that the people who actually make the decisions in government are elected. And therefore, their number one priority in life is to get re-elected. So the enormous emphasis that we have had to have in this community, for forever really, is to accept that public policy is ultimately going to follow public opinion rather than lead public opinion, and therefore that we have to do a lot of opinion forming. We have to go out there and really get stuck in on stage and on camera as much as possible, so as to educate the public to the point where they understand that taxpayers' money spent on hastening the medical control of aging is money well spent. Now that's very much still a work in progress. Well, I think we're getting there. You know, I think now, especially, I think that now we are seeing the reality of the concept of rejuvenation, which ultimately is what people who pay taxes care about, rather than retardation of aging. Now we've got to that point, the battle is beginning to get easier, but there's still a hell of a long way to go. I think what's happening in government right now really is people are preparing to change policy rather than actually changing policy.
Yeah, Keith, you see anything going on there on the government side?
Yeah, so I want to very much follow along that point Aubrey was making. And, while Nir was kind of talking about this in terms of, the regulatory aspects, I think the same point applies to the legislative, process, in that policymakers, much like the public, don't care about the inside the bubble issues that we were talking about earlier, about whether aging is classified as a disease or not. They just want to know what are the inputs and what would the outputs be? Would it be effective? And how does that relate to my reelection chances if you're a policymaker, right? So I think on that point, one opportunity that we can grasp upon now, especially in the current environment, is to see how what we're trying to do perfectly meshes in with a lot of issues and causes that people are already very passionate about. Ideas like, the current healthcare system is broken. Do we need something like universal healthcare? Preventative medicine, right? Now, you might want to think that might be partisan, but if we're smart about it, you can see how you can easily tailor that pitch to those on let's use America as an example, both sides, right? If you're a left-wing Medicare for all advocate, you could say, hey, if you want that government to pay for healthcare, because of the gray tsunami, if we don't get on this, it's going to be economically perilous and jeopardize you to legitimate political attack. On the right-hand side, you could say, hey, those scary socialists trying to push for Medicare for all. Well, if we can make the current healthcare system less of a burden on everybody with less costs with their private healthcare, maybe that'll ease that tension. So you should care about it too. We can tailor this message because it's true. It would benefit everybody. And I think we can make that case better.
I want to make one more point on this, which is quite important, because this is really a criticism of the gerontology community, which I've been making for the best part of 20 years, actually. I believe that a fundamental difficulty here is the disconnect that exists in terms of the feasibility of doing anything about aging. In a way, you're right, Keith, that the terminology and whether aging is a disease or not doesn't really matter. But in one sense, it does matter, because if people are going out there and emphasizing the distinction between aging on the one hand and diseases on the other hand, then what the public hear is aging is off limits for medicine. Aging is kind of, this thing that's woven into the fabric of the universe, and it's universal and natural and inevitable, and it's just kind of, we can't do anything about it. And therefore, that any academic who comes along and asks for taxpayers' money to try to do something about aging, they're just trying to ignore the fundamental reality of the universe, and they're just trying to get money for their careers. We have to break that down. What I've been saying since forever is that the only people who can break it down are the gerontologists. It doesn't matter how much you tell the politicians that it would be enormously huge bang for the buck to spend the odd few billion on research, you'd save the odd few trillion per year on medical costs, if you refuse, as gerontologists, to say how likely it is that X amount of progress would be made using X number of dollars, in X amount of time. If you don't make statements with those numbers in it, then you're screwed. You're never going to convince anybody. And of course, scientists are very, very reluctant to overpromise and underdeliver, and so they have refused to do this. And indeed, I have repeatedly been cast as irresponsible for giving time frame estimates, even probabilistic ones. I believe that ultimately it's short-sighted for gerontologists not to do that.
Nir.
So Aubrey, I want to say something, and again, what you said is right, but let me tell you, because the difference between us, Aubrey, is that you started as a theoretician and went to biology, and I started as an MD and went to biology, okay? But listen what I learned in first day of medical school. Do no harm, okay? Immediately, do no harm, okay? You become conservative in the first day of medical school and you are that way, okay? The second day that you're taught that there's no always and no never in medicine, okay? So you become unsure of yourself, okay? This is who we are. I mean, it's hard for me to break down and call the future for what I think it is based on who I am. And it's actually people like me and Jim Kirkland who are MD that are in better stage of dealing with those FDA and other people and make the change, but realizing who they are, what they were told. And it's difficult.
I feel your pain there, I really do. And certainly I think this is a distinction between the conversations with the regulatory authorities and the conversations with the legislative branch that Keith was making earlier. You're completely right. I mean, the FDA are basically working within the first do no harm paradigm, same as the MDs are, and that makes perfect sense. But the politicians are weighing the probabilities in a very unhippocratic way, right? And therefore, what they want to know is what is the likelihood.
Yeah, that longevity dialogue, the longevity dividend.
Yeah,
sounds good.
Just to pick up one point there, we had spoke about this earlier, but this is while I'm very much in favor of everything longevity dividend, as you all know, this I think is an identified point where some of the previous arguments from years ago were lacking in that, specifying the probability of success, because then politicians look at it and say 0 times whatever is 0, and okay, I'm out. So we definitely need to make all sides of the equation have reasonable, estimates, but reasonable points for discussion, to have a discussion.
Well, I think we all realize that demand from the public is going to be a very big part of this, because if the public really gets behind it, realizes this can happen, and it's not easy to educate a broad public, because you have, first of all, different levels of education and different levels of belief, and you've got religious and philosophical potential opposition to it, and all that to deal with. So that's a big problem that maybe could make the other problems somewhat smaller. So I'm going to start on this one with Keith as the Life Extension Advocacy Foundation. We're really trying to be a major news source for longevity and aging research. And I'd like your views on how, we, and I'm saying we because I with Seeking Delphi, okay, I'm a futurist, I have a lot of topics, but this is one of my main ones. I am an advocate for this. What can we do to work with the scientists and help them?
Sure. I mean, as we mentioned before, this is all correlated. How politicians feel about it, how researchers feel about it, how investors feel about it is in some sense predicated on what the mood of the public is, right? So that was sort of the, inciting, lay of the land that led to the formation of LEAF in the first place. Was we saw that this field could use, in a sense, a PR wing to help contextualize what's actually happening and why it could be beneficial to the public. And I think, I've mentioned it many times before, but a great instructive example here is the early cancer advocates in the American Cancer Society, Mary Lasker, Sidney Farber, et cetera. And again, I don't know how reasoned this was in terms of a battle plan, but it seems like they followed a 1, 2, 3 kind of process. Find legitimate, credible research, build support behind it. Then step 2, build understanding and awareness by running essentially PR campaigns, the Jimmy Fund, that got people aware of what was possible, raised some funds, and then built that up into essentially a grassroots movement that then could lean on the levers of power. The example I look at, you can find it, is these like full page spreads in the New York Times that basically said, like, Nixon, what the hell are you doing? You got to fund this research. We're dying in the streets here, right? And I think very much those same tactics can apply here. And there's a lot of details there, like how you tailor your message to different audiences. For example, one thing that a lot of people in our field might not be aware of is that, a lot of statistics show that women, for example, are the primary stakeholders here in some extent, not only getting hit by certain diseases worse, but being the chief arbiters of the healthcare decisions of a family, right? So I think that knowledge is useful to know, to make sure that whatever messages that we're putting out there, don't leave women behind, because they're very important to this conversation and swaying the public. And there's also some discussions of cognitive biases that we don't have time to really get into the weeds on, but one example that I think we can talk about is scope neglect, right? The classic example that if you try to tell someone, like, there's 1 million starving kids, and if you give $100, you'll give a bag of rice to every one of those kids, right? That's less effective than just telling a story about this one particular kid. Even if it's the same amount and the bag of rice will only go to that one person, it's more effective because you're building an emotional connection. You're circumventing the, millions of people. I can't conceive of it, but I can conceive of that one person. So again, persuasion is a science too. And I think if our whole chief aim here is to, serve science, we should not forget that.
Nir.
So I totally agree. And let me add, because this is, it's lesson from the election. How do we increase our supporters, right? So I think we've neglected several things. We've neglected that people who survive cancer because of radiation and chemotherapy are aging rapidly. They're getting severe age-related disease, and particularly the children, okay? They need help there. This kid with the rice story, we can get somebody with that had cancer and all of a sudden has a coronary, okay? As somebody will say, this is aging, right? People with HIV and I realize that HIV is a political issue, but people with HIV get their diseases 10 years ahead of their chronological age. People who are disabled and who cannot move and they eat more, they get diseases much younger. But even more than that, what about astronauts? Okay, you want to go to Mars, right? You're not going to get there if we don't solve aging, right? Because you'll get cancer or coronary, you'll never be back. Okay, so we have to explain this is about health at any age, and certainly when you get there, okay? And children just don't see themselves looking like their grandparents. They think their grandparents were born like that. Okay, so I think there's a constituency that we need to reach to and make it a broader story. By the way, I would say poor people can afford metformin, but they cannot afford to eat well, you know, or exercise, right?
Yeah, I want to jump on that just because it's so on target. And this is where I think if we play our cards right, this could become actually something very legitimately exciting that people get passionate about on a grand scale. So what you just said there, Nir, right? I think, you know, a lot of people in our field might not be aware of Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign, right? Or the things that, you know, Leonard Hayflick was saying in the 70s. You know, there's a, to use a buzzword, an intersectionality here, right? The disease of the poor disproportionately affect, the disease of aging disproportionately affect the poor, minorities, women, right? So there's a way that if we can position this right, it could be very galvanizing and not only pull more of the public into what we're doing and see it as something they have like ownership and agency in, but also create a really natural line to make alliances with more, you know, mainstream organizations that serve these other goals.
Well, that brings us to another issue, and it's an issue that I have been talking with Aubrey and Keith with. They have been good enough to advise me and two partners, and we hope to partner with LEAF on a major project. And I'm going to, in a minute, introduce my two partners in this because I think I'm here, and that is what we're calling Life Plus. It's to try and create a massive public media, education, mobilization campaign, and with that, perhaps create a public charity that might do for longevity what, say, the American Cancer Society did for cancer at a time when people didn't even want to talk about cancer. And that will be, we hope to begin with, a documentary, a companion book, a social media campaign, substantial research into the messaging to the broad public, not just the intelligentsia, not just the kind of people who are on there now, maybe starting with the low-hanging fruit, and try to build that into an actual charitable organization in partnership with LEAF that will actually start to raise the kind of money and create the kind of awareness with the general public that those organizations do. And I'd like to, first of all, introduce the guy who's the germ of idea was first on it. And Greg, I see you're there. Hopefully you're listening. I'm going to promote you to panelists. I'm going to introduce Greg Grinberg, who's the founder of Actual Food, and I know he's going to want to proselytize on what Nir was saying about in terms of lifestyle, because that's the starting point. And at some point, Aubrey, we're going to do one of these on the on longevity escape velocity, and I know he'll have a lot to say there. But let's get Greg on here because this started with a germ of an idea with him to do a documentary. So let's see here. Here comes Greg, I think. Are you there, Greg?
Hey, Mark.
Everybody say hi to Greg. Just give us 30 seconds of your view on what's been said about the public here, and then we'll wrap up with Steve Katz. And hopefully, if we have time before everyone has to leave, we'll see if we have any questions from our viewers.
Well, absolutely. Well, saving the proselytizing about lifestyle medicine for another day. Aubrey said it. I mean, the battle is now to reach the wider world. And now that regenerative medicine and the damage repair approach have become a mainstream field of research within the geroscience community, we believe it's time for us, the longevity movement, to take direct control over our public messaging in a coordinated and concerted effort. In other words, to stop relying on clickbait journalists and outside filmmakers and take our message directly to the public. a public, after all, that is hungry for real solutions. And as Keith said, we think that there is actually a pre-existing playbook on how to do this, namely the American Cancer Society that got its start over 100 years ago. And there's a set of things, in other words, professional marketing, systematic approaches to engineering optimal messaging and outreach for the general public that the American Cancer Society does, that the American Diabetes Association does, that the American Lung Association does, but that we in the longevity community are not quite doing quite yet. And so we need an analog to that, we think, and that's what we want Life Plus to be, not only to create a public zeitgeist in favor of longevity, but to bring the kinds of financial support that these organizations pull in, which is collectively on the order of $1 billion annually. In other words, if we want to unlock the floodgates of philanthropic support to fully fund our research roadmap in regenerative medicine, then we believe that it's crucial that we do this, that it's crucial. A professionalized marketing and public mobilization campaign that is truly of, by, and for the longevity movement. And to be of, by, and for the longevity movement, we think it's really important also that we fund Life Plus, at least initially, within the longevity movement as well. And as you said, Mark, our early deliverables will be a feature film documentary and corresponding book and accompanying social media campaign, very loosely speaking, the inconvenient truth of human health, if you will. Except that in our case, of course, it's an incredibly convenient truth. The scourge of aging and chronic disease that claim 100,000 lives every day is something that we can probably do something about, and very possibly in time for the majority of people alive today. And yes, we can reach the public on an emotional level and perhaps even get past that catch-22 that we were talking about earlier that concerns the probability of success and what that presents with respect to funding. So we're Life Plus, and you can get in touch with us at lifeplusmedia.com or through Keith or Aubrey, if you guys will forgive me for offering that.
That's okay. Thanks, Greg. That's important stuff. And just very quickly, just to say hi, if he's there, I'm going to try and get, I think that's Steve Katz, who's our producer director, who has just an incredible resume in terms of his filmmaking ability. He's a best-selling author. He's written the best-selling film directing textbook of all time. I don't know if Steve's still with us or not. Perhaps not. So, oh, there he is. Steve,
Oh, hi there.
say hi to everybody.
Hey,
And
good to see everybody.
Steve has writes for Variety. He has he's worked with Saturday Night Live, MTV, Warren Buffett, Michael Jackson, run big animation studios. So he's our real chops when it comes to the professional level of book publishing and filmmaking. So with that, I'm just going to see, does anybody have a question? If anybody has a question, please, now's the time to either raise your hand or write it in the Q&A file. I'll give you a minute on that. And if not, okay, let's see. We got one from David Wood here. He's got a question on the focus of messaging to win public support. Should the emphasis be upon the credibility of therapies that can extend healthy longevity by, say, 3 to 5 years, or on the credibility of therapies that could somewhat later actually reverse aging and therefore extend healthy longevity indefinitely? Boy, we could go a whole hour just on that. But who would like to weigh in first among our original panelists? Keith.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the answer would be both if we can, but it might be slightly different for different types of media. So, for example, if you're going for something that's going to try to influence, legislators, for example, like the Inconvenient Truth or something, probably the near-term benefits that we could be reaping right now, and there's no reason why we're not. That I think would be a very good, hammer in your hand. As far as, say, fiction movies and that sort of stuff, I think that there actually is a lot of compelling evidence that shows the kinds of media that comes out there reflects the mood of the public. There's more vampire movies in times of economic recession and more zombie movies in times of, overconsumption. And I think that door swings both ways. So there's a lot of media that shows how horrible living longer would be. And there's not enough media that shows how wonderful it could be. And I think there needs to be more of that.
So what I do in this, even though, I constantly get called the prophet of immortality and other stuff like that, I'm constantly out there pointing out that it's not about longevity. and that longevity is just a side effect of health. And that insofar as one does want to think about longevity, one to think about it 1 year at a time, or at least 1 decade at a time. Therefore, I'm constantly focusing on rejuvenation, because the point is that really is a thing. Even if we are only talking about a small amount of increase in longevity, people definitely want it to be healthy longevity. And therefore, if they're already, moving into the age-related chronic conditions of late life, then they definitely want to see something that turns the clock back, not just something that slows the clock down. So I think we can steer the conversation to some extent away from the longevity issue and in the direction that people are more interested in hearing, and thereby kind of sidestep the dystopic nonsense that gets talked about in science fiction.
And that's a book that was published in June, and it is for intelligent lay people, and it's about kind of stories and principles that we see that is easy to read and access because it has stories of centenarians and other things, but also science, also about treatment that's available, also about future, and this is a book that's supposed to take care of some of what we now for the public, for the intelligent public.
We have one more question here, and it comes, we got a couple. So let's see here. We got from Steve Hill. Our field is plagued by a lot of snake oil and woo. How can we as a community better unite to oust such hucksters which tarnish our field's credibility? That's a tough one and a good one.
Can I start on that? He is absolutely right. He's absolutely right. It's terrible, and it is poor. It reflects poorly of us if we cannot really make the differences. So my view is that we don't use anti-aging. We are geroscientists. We have geroprotectors or gerotherapeutics. I think we just have to find the words. And just to show you how difficult it is, there was a paper, the Wall Street Journal was going they actually wrote a paper on metformin several years ago. And I said to the reporter, don't use anti-aging. I'm not using anti-aging. We're not using anti-aging. Anti-aging is the enemy. And sure enough, the title was anti-aging, the anti-aging metformin. And I called her and I said, why? And she said, well, I'll tell you why. Because I went to the editor. And I said what you said, and he said, let's check it out. Scientists are not using anti-aging, and he got scientists, all the scientists under other paper, they didn't use it probably, but they had an anti-aging title. So we couldn't change this in the papers because we're telling them it's illegitimate and it is for them.
It's true. The tyranny of editors is not widely recognized, but it's very, very strong. It happens all the time. And editors, after all, let's face it, they are paid to sell papers. So it's not surprising, but it's a huge problem. My solution to what Steve asks has always been grow a beard that is so long that it's impossible to feel that I could possibly be in this business for personal financial gain. And that has worked pretty well. But yeah, we've got to do more than that. Yeah, certainly.
Well,
to follow up,
go ahead.
To follow up on that, not so much the beard part. I think some aspect of this also is regulatory, right? Like smarter regulation over the supplement industry. But aside from that, I think there are also things that our field can do internally. So, for example, with regular journalism, there's a code of ethics, right? I think, this is something we've actually been talking about maybe putting forth, some sort of code of ethics for, longevity research journalism, what things are, beyond the pale, of how to characterize what things are cures or not, put out some sort of rubric that this is, if you're interested in being a good faith actor, here's how you should be covering this stuff,
Well, I can tell you guys that I personally kind of cringe, and I love Jose Cordero, but whenever he calls himself an immortalist, I cringe because guys, there are a lot of other things that can kill you besides the diseases of aging, and the odds are if you live long enough, one of them is going to get you. So I don't really think anybody's really going to live remotely forever. But you know, as Aubrey says, if it's a side effect, a very good side effect, that you live longer and even the maximum potential lifespan gets longer because we have been able to deal with the damage of aging, then we get the longevity dividend. We've got this gray tsunami coming that can be disastrous at a time when birth rates are going down globally. So obviously, be really good to get that. So I want to, if any of you guys have any closing comments, please let me know. I don't see any more questions. Otherwise, I want to thank Keith, Aubrey, and Nir for joining us today, guys. Always a pleasure to have you on. All my everybody viewing this and everybody online. The next Longevity Dialogues is in the works for next month. Thank you.
Thank you.